Mama, look, the governor's coming.
He better. Let me see. Oh, boy.
Hell yeah! Hell yeah!
Welcome back, Truth Seekers. I have a very exciting show lined up for you today. I think it's going to be exciting. I've actually been a fan of my guest probably for about 2 years when I stumbled upon her on Instagram, and I always look forward to her posts. She's a historian and a retired lawyer. Her name is Tara Ross, and she's written a brand new book called The Indispensable Electoral College. You can see it right there. Tara, it's a pleasure to have you. Welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So I meant what I said. I got on Instagram probably, I want to say 18 months or 2 years ago. Don't remember how long ago it was. I know you have a huge following on Facebook, but for anyone who still is using Facebook or Instagram, this is the one page I recommend to anyone who likes history. I know History in Pictures has like millions of followers. I feel like that one leaves me wanting a lot more. Your page, on the other hand, the most random historical stuff. It's gold. It's fantastic. You went from Medal of Honor winners to who's in the tomb of the what's it called? The unknown soldier. And then this morning, you had an excellent one. I can't remember what it was because they all just kind of blend together. I just really enjoy your page. What did you post about this morning?
This morning is Nellie Bly and her trip around the world in 72 days.
Where do you get this? It can't all be in your head, right?
No, it's not all in my head. It's research. So I just read a lot. I don't know.
You said in the pre-show you're a bit of a nerd, right? So
sometimes I'm literally like going to Kindle and like searching for dates, like go to Calvin Coolidge's biography and search for November 15th. Did anything happen? And just figure it out. I don't know.
It's wonderful.
Lots of tactics.
In fact, I'm probably going to put some of it on the screen here so people go and do this. I know. It was about Ellis Island. I was fascinated to learn about how Ellis was one of several outposts that was used for immigration, and eventually it was no longer used for that purpose. And that you said that the states originally were in charge of it. How about that?
Right.
So who knew? So here's the thing. There was some really, really good content put out. One of the articles was by you. I thought it was fantastic about the importance of the Electoral College. I think my challenge is, how do we make people care about this? I know you wrote the book, but how do we go from this being completely wonk nerdiness to something that people should really have in the front of their minds as a invaluable tool that was inspired by the founders to make sure that our country didn't tear itself apart during election season? How did you tackle that challenge, and why should people read this?
Well, I think it's probably much like what I do on my Instagram page, actually, or my Facebook page, which is to find the story, right? Memorizing lists of facts or dates or just the founders did this because, list fact is boring. What's more interesting is to read a story and to talk about what happened. What were the human dynamics? What are the human dynamics going on right now today? What were the dynamics going on in other years where maybe people were concerned that the Electoral College was failing? And what are the common factors that brought that show that the Electoral College succeeded? So it's a story, I guess, is the answer to your question. It's human interest and human drama and human emotion. And once we understand how it ties into our life, then it's easy to learn about, I think, and easy to understand why it works for us today.
How much were you pulling your hair out every time you heard that Hillary Clinton won the popular vote? How nails on a chalkboard is that for you? Or is there something that supersedes that in terms of just general aggravation?
Well, it's irrelevant, right? I mean, nobody was playing or was running their campaign to get the most popular votes. It's a little bit like saying, well, but the Yankees won the most runs in the 1960 World Series, and they should be the world, they did win the most runs, but they lost the most games. And so they were not the winners of the World Series that year. You have a game, you have rules in place to accomplish a particular purpose, and whoever plays by the rules and accomplishes the goals of the game, that's the winner. And that's how we do it in sports, and that's how we do it in presidential campaigns. So Hillary actually ran up her popular vote number on purpose because she thought she was about to win the Electoral College and lose the popular vote. So she was running up her numbers in safe spots. And that's the exact opposite of what the Electoral College requires. The Electoral College requires coalition building and getting support across states. So if she had simply done that and quit trying to run up her popular vote total, she probably would have won.
I hadn't really heard much about that, but that makes sense, right? To take away any criticisms of her victory. And it was a bad gamble. I read recently that, or I guess it's not recently anymore. It feels like it wasn't that long ago. I've been watching people scream at the sky for like 2 weeks straight, so time kind of slows down. I read that the county count for Donald Trump was almost 5 times higher. You probably know the stats. I hadn't read this before. 5 times higher than Hillary Clinton's nationwide, I believe. 20,
It's really high. I don't know the exact difference, but there's a really big difference.
it was like 2,400 to 500 or something like that.
That's way more counties, more states. Her support is very heavily concentrated. She got 20% of her support from only New York and California, 20%. And in those states, she got it mainly from the big urban areas. So, that's exactly what we're trying to avoid here. The Electoral College is intended to encourage people to build coalitions, to build support across state lines and across regions. And, it was the opposite of what she did. So that's why she lost.
Tell us what the aha moments are. What's someone going to take away from this book saying, you know what, I had no idea. I'm really glad you told me that, Tara.
Well, I think maybe the most surprising chapters to some people will be the last 3 chapters. They are all about the state's role in the presidential election system, what the states can do, what the states, the founders empowered the states to be in charge of presidential elections. I think we have gotten so used to nationalizing everything. We centralize everything in DC. We put so much power in the RNC or the DNC or the Commission on Presidential Debates or the mainstream media, whatever it is. Everything is so centralized, and the founders never intended that. They meant for the states to be in charge, for it to be a very decentralized process. There are 51 different elections in this country for presidents, 50 states plus DC. And so I dug up all of these examples of states acting for their own interest. For example, in 1876, Colorado did not hold a presidential election. They just didn't do it. The state legislature appointed electors, and that's because they didn't have enough money. They were having logistical problems running an election that year. So they did what was best for Colorado. They just canceled. They didn't ever hold an election. The state legislature appointed electors. Wyoming let women vote before other people. They didn't ask New York for permission. They just did it because they thought it was a good thing. There's a host of examples like this. And my theory is that the further we have strayed from the founders' vision of a decentralized process in which the states are in charge, the more just kind of upset and divided and angry we are as a nation. And that maybe we can serve ourselves best by learning more about the system and going back to what the founders intended.
So something that I really get a lot of joy out of actually is after the election's over, finding out who the people are that are against the Electoral College or say that it's antiquated or that it needs to be disposed of. And I find that they're usually a lot of the same people that are morally preening us about the way we treat women, and they work in Hollywood. I see a lot of interesting correlations. So talk to us about why certain people want to get rid of the Electoral College. I mean, my throwaway line was, keep the Electoral College said no dictator ever. They just don't like it very much. So I enjoy listening to them complain about how much they dislike it.
I think people want to get rid of the Electoral College for a variety of reasons. I think some people just don't understand it. And so the sound bites against the Electoral College are super easy. They sound like common sense, right? You hear people say things like one person, one vote, and democracy's great. It's just the sound bites are so easy to throw out. And I think a lot of it is just simple lack of knowledge and education because nobody in our school systems has really taught us about this. So my experience is that the more people know about it, the more likely they are to support it and to understand the reasons why the Electoral College actually is just a part of our system of checks and balances and a safeguard for our liberty, not something that gets in our way. I think there are also people who will just never, ever, ever buy any of that. They're just very fixated on one person, one vote. That's the way it is. And look, people will disagree. That's fine. That's one of the great things about America. We get to disagree here.
Well, then let's go back to the historical examples. I really enjoyed, you had 2 chapters that gave specific historical election examples of how important the Electoral College is. You talked about 1824 and 1876 and Much Ado About Nothing. Tell us why those elections were important.
Well, I went through each election where there was a discrepancy between the popular vote and the electoral vote to discuss what happened in those years. So for those 2, people who don't like the Electoral College will include them in their count of it's gone awry 5 times. It's terrible. But actually, if you look at 1824 and 1876, I think what you discover, it's just not fairly included in the count. In 1824, not every state was holding a presidential election at the time. And as it turned out, the John Quincy states were more likely to have a state legislature directly elect their electors than some of the other states. So even though you have a national popular vote total that seems to favor Andrew Jackson, actually, there's just no way. There's no way to know what the total would have been if we had held an election in every single state that year. 1876 was a little bit different. It had this was in the wake of the Civil War. There was a lot of division between North and South. There was allegations that votes were being suppressed. There was a whole mess of stuff going on. But at the end of the day, there were 4 states in which the electors were disputed. 2 slates of electors were submitted from each state. And it turned to, I mean, if you think Florida 2000 was bad, they were messing over that for months, trying to decide which slates of electors to accept. And in the end, they figured it out and moved on. But so first of all, I would say that election was just chaos. There was one state, I mentioned Colorado, that did not hold an election. So there really is no national popular vote total. But in any event, the Electoral College helped us that year by confining the problems to 4 states. Imagine the chaos. It was already chaotic. Imagine the chaos if instead of 4 states, we had been dealing with this in every single state in the nation. So those 2 elections are used by anti-Electoral College people, but they're really not very good examples.
Yeah, you're right. Isolating them, especially after the Civil War. I think the mindset after that would have been, and I don't remember if it was 1896 or whether election that the parties accuse each other of throwing the election, but I can't imagine trying to solve that problem peacefully. And we have a foreign exchange student that we used to have here that talked about how they run elections in their country. And I won't mention which one it was, but as we had this discussion about the Electoral College, he's kind of just fascinated about the way that we do things. And I think we take it for granted, being from here, that it is an ingenious way to take the small vote in every single county and make it somehow count in the national election per the state. Right. So talk a little bit about the role of the states. I mentioned immigration earlier with Ellis Island, but in some of these other examples you gave, you really put a lot of emphasis on why the state's role is so important and how that's kind of what's diminished today in terms of the national democracy and this discussion about whether it's Al Gore or Hillary Clinton and the individual votes that they receive.
Well, I think it's important to go look at the convention in general and what the dynamics were there. And there was a constant just back and forth discussion, debate about what do we give the states power for? What do we do? How much do we give to the national government? And it was a huge question. And really, I think at the end of the day, the founders understood you cannot trust anybody completely. Okay, somebody is going to mess up. We are human beings. We are flawed. We are imperfect. If you give too much power to the national government, the presidential election will not be right. If you give too much power to the state governments, it won't be right either. And I think as I went through all these historical examples, I did find examples of states probably not behaving for really good motives, refusing to put Abraham Lincoln on the ballot, for example, in some southern states, or the motivations there were not always great. But I think what's important to remember is the structure that the founders were going for, which is to put competing powers against each other, whether it's executive versus judicial or states versus national government. They just were always trying to have different parts of our government competing. They said ambition against ambition will counteract ambition. One person's selfish self-interest will counteract the other person's selfish self-interest. So the states have a lot of power. They probably do have most of the power. The national government retains some authority to, count the electoral votes and that sort of thing. But the states have a lot of power in our presidential election system. To the degree that they did give the power to the federal government, they gave it to Congress, which I think is important, and not to the executive. The president has no authority in this area, which makes you wonder about the Fraud Commission a little bit, by the way. But the reason for that is simple, because if you give Congress or if you give the president so much power, he can control his own reelection. All of a sudden, you've got national bureaucracies with a presidential appointee running them and this sort of thing. And this is exactly the kind of thing we avoid in America. We give the power to the states so that ultimately the president is not in charge of his own reelection.
One of the better arguments I've heard against the Electoral College, one that I think maybe resonates with more people, is the technological advantages that we have that they didn't have at the time that they created it, and how that's made it obsolete. Why don't you dismantle that one for me real quick? Yeah.
Look, it is a myth that is out there. People believe it, and it sounds good.
It does sound good. Yeah.
They went around in horse and carriages. The Constitutional Convention started late because they couldn't even get there on time. It all sounds great. But at the end of the day, this is not why the Electoral College was created. It's not even close. They were not on the floor of that convention, oh, but it took us so long to get here. What they were saying were things like, power corrupts. You cannot trust people. You cannot trust anybody at all. In fact, there's a historian that I quote in my book named Carol Birkin who made such an interesting observation. She said, the room was full of the men most likely to be senator and president. And they sat there and they debated how to put checks and balances on themselves because they did not even trust themselves. They didn't. So sometimes people say, well, they didn't let people vote for president because they didn't trust the people. Well, sort of, but they didn't trust anybody. They literally put checks and balances on everybody, voters, government officials, federal government, state governments, everybody, judiciary, everybody has their own set of checks on them. That is the reason the Electoral College exists, is because people are imperfect. So we have an internet now, but I'll tell you, we're all looking at the same headlines right now, and they are showing us clearly that people are imperfect and corrupt and will abuse power if they get the chance to do it. So the Electoral College is still very much needed. Yeah,
I often quote from Patriot's History of the United States, where he said, you can argue that the founders were flawed and they had some issues and they did participate in slavery, but what you can't say is that any of those men had a strong desire to rule over the lives of others, because that was the most important factor in setting up this government. Now, in terms of, I just interrupted my own great question I was going to ask you next. Let me see if I can remember what it was. Nope, I totally lost it. All right, so let's switch gears. Oh, I know what it was. In terms of relevance, let's bring this forward to 2016. What lessons can we learn from, I heard Lawrence O'Donnell has a new book, and I heard him on MedVed talking about how he was at he wrote about the 68 convention, the Democratic convention, what a disaster that was. Right. And here's a guy who was a sky screamer, I'll call him, right? Screaming at the sky about Donald Trump, saying, you know what, this election, we threw all these epithets and we gave it all these terms to describe how intense it was and how it's life-changing, the economy's going to fail. He goes, you realize really the only big difference is we had a candidate unlike one we'd had in a long time, a reality TV show star. He had some unkind words for Trump because that was really the only difference. And I thought, what a difference a year makes. I mean, this is a guy who was on the air decrying about how our country was coming to an end, basically admitting that if you look historically, it's been a lot worse than it was in 2016. But I'd still like to ask you what lessons specifically we can learn from this historic election year of 2016 and how it pertains to the Electoral College.
I think there's two lessons I have taken from it. One is we alluded to it earlier. You cannot build a base of support in two states and expect to win the Electoral College. And I hope everybody takes that very seriously from now on. I hope both parties work to gather more people under their umbrella, look for the things that bring us together, that make us similar, not the things that make us so angry and drive us apart. I hope the Democrats look and see what FDR did right to build coalitions. I hope Republicans look to Reagan to see what Reagan did right to build coalitions. Both of the parties are broken in this regard, in my opinion. Both of the parties have work to do. And I hope that if the Democrats get their act together on this coalition building business and quit griping about the fact that they lost the election even though they won the popular vote, they will win. And Republicans should take that seriously and start working on their own internal problems too. The second thing that I took from this is anything can happen. Do not ever assume it can't happen. We have seen anything can happen. And how that becomes relevant later, I think, is just looking at the processes that we're going to put in place or the policies that we're going to put in place going forward, and to not be so fixated on one set of circumstances in one election year that we end up handicapping ourselves. As an example, lots of states have reacted to 2016 by trying to enact new laws to bind their electors. Okay, I testified against that in my home state of Texas. And the reason I testified against that is because what I told them was bad facts make bad law. Do not look at 2016 and be so mad about what happened there that you bind yourself for future years. There are so many different other things that could happen. And don't just look at me and say, well, that's never going to happen. Okay, anything can happen. So what if a presidential candidate has a stroke after the election, but before the meetings of the elector? And he's in a coma and not expected to make it. Do you want your electors to go vote for that person? Or would you rather be free to go vote for the vice presidential candidate? I'm thinking we want them to vote for the vice presidential candidate. What if Watergate breaks? This is an example I gave in my book. What if Watergate breaks in those weeks in between election day and the meetings of the electors, and both the president and the vice president are incumbents and they're about to win, but now they're about to be impeached? which, by the way, makes them ineligible to be president, which means by the time that Congress counts the votes, they're not eligible, so they cannot be elected, which means the losing presidential candidate is the only candidate in a House contingent election. We want our electors to have independence in certain scenarios. So the better route is to discuss what policies will states enact. Let's discuss this in each state. What policies make sense? Maybe some states will say, I think our electors, the process of electing them should be more transparent. So we know who they are. We know their names. We know what they stand for. We can trust them if there's an emergency like Watergate. Maybe some states will say, we're going to immediately hold a special legislative session in, these 5 different kinds of circumstances. Every state can make its own decision, but let's not just look at 2016 and react. Let's respond calmly.
I love it. I love it. As I read through the book and now as we're talking, I wonder, a lot of people I talk to, they have this very direct focus of what they're trying to accomplish and what the mission is. And as I speak to you, I just get the sense that you have the burden of knowing all these things that a lot of people unfortunately don't know. So what's the end game for you? What do the next 5 or 10 years look like? What are you trying to accomplish? What's the purpose behind it?
Gosh, that's so true. I did spend lots of last year just wishing people knew more. I think a lot of pain could have been avoided. Just people felt so stuck, and I was we're not stuck. We're only stuck because we don't know more. And so that's really why I was interested in writing this book. I thought I was done. I mean, it's my 3rd book about the Electoral College. I thought I had nothing left to say, but clearly that was wrong. And so I hope to empower voters with more information. As for what I'm doing the next 5 or 10 years, I guess I'm probably just doing more of the same. I have a kid's book about the Electoral College, and I've thought about doing more of that stuff too. But I think education, knowledge is power. And so that's just what I do. So I'm sure I will do it on a variety of fronts.
I was going to talk a little bit more about your platform, because I think that what's so important I was talking to Brian McClanahan a couple weeks ago about how important it is for authors to have their own platform now. And yours is fantastic. I don't think it's as large as it should be, at least not on Instagram. I know your Facebook page is pretty big. Mm-hmm. But in terms of the Lawrence O'Donnell and talking about the election, you did have one recently where you talked about how Truman held up the newspaper that said Dewey defeats Truman. I didn't know, and you pointed this out, that when he got to Washington, the press basically put up a banner that said what?
We're ready to eat crow anytime you're ready to serve it,
That's
Mr. President. Yeah.
Something that would never happen until hell freezes over today.
People had maybe a little bit more dignity at times. Things did get really ugly during that election. I mean, you're right when you're talking about that before. The convention was ugly. It's in my book. I was talking about it. As an example of states versus national power and how nobody's claiming everybody's perfect. No, nobody's perfect. But that election got ugly. But at the end, I thought it was a very graceful thing for the media to say that. We're ready to eat crow, Mr. President.
To kneel, as it were. So if you're looking for actual great historical accuracy and advice, I think Tara Ross is the place to go. I'm just scrolling through your Instagram page. You had one recently where you talked about how Mount Rushmore was actually supposed to be from the waist up, but surprise, surprise, they ran out of money. So now we just have, the Puerto Rican assassins. I gave my friend from Puerto Rico a hard time because he's such a Puerto Rico fan. I didn't realize that they'd broken into the White House and tried to kill the president. Didn't know about that.
It was kind of weird. Yeah. He was in Blair House at the time because they were renovating the White House. So he was actually across the street in Blair House, but they broke in, and one of the security guards ended up taking out the last assassin, but he was already dying. He'd already been shot by the assassin and he was dying, but he got himself up and shot the assassin, saved Truman's life probably.
I roll through here and I think, man, what could have been if I didn't attend government school? I don't know about any of this stuff. But I wish you a lot of luck with the book. I thought I'm almost finished with it. I think it's excellent and fantastic, and it saddens me that it'll be a couple more years before I get to really pound anyone with the information in here again.
Thank you.
I don't know if you have any dissonance about that, but is there anything else you'd like to tell your readers about why they should run out and buy this right away? Did we miss anything?
Oh, I think it will surprise people how seriously states took their duty to represent themselves in the presidential election process in the past. I think they will be surprised at how much is in there.
What are the easiest steps that at the state level or at the community level we can take to get back to what we've kind of lost in terms of taking the election seriously?
My opinion is that we, the voters, need to know more. I think that state officials don't have much motivation right now to change anything. I think most of them are pretty pretty loyal to their party. And so if we want change, we're going to have to do it ourselves. And the first step in that is just to learn more, know more of what's possible.
Tara Ross, 1787, author of multiple books on the Electoral College, including the most recent one, The Indispensable Electoral College. Thank you so much for your time, and best of luck to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.